All right, so still dealing with some of these changes that are happening in what we call the late Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance. So talked about the beginning of globalization and all the terrible things that happened associated with that. But again, kind of get your mind around the idea of how much the whole concept of knowledge was changing at this time. For example, as people read these books that have been brought to Europe through the Crusades and then the following trade that came, the Europeans began to realize how advanced the Eastern cultures were in terms of medicine, knowledge of the world, cosmology, and the shape of the universe, stars, things like that. And they started to realize that there are ways of learning other than just logic. Like, there's no way just logic would have shown you that there are continents that you don't know about. And there are whole species of animals that were unknown, completely unknown. And then just more and more awareness came that maybe there are ways to learn about life that we've never tried before. Like, they would see these books with amazingly detailed explanations of human anatomy and realize you can't figure out what the liver's for just by thinking about it. You won't even know you have one. So let's try open a dead body and see what's inside. And they started doing autopsies in cadaver labs to see and really study what's inside a human body. And then and you start thinking, okay, you have this thing that's about the size of a fist that's in everybody's chest. It's probably the thing that we feel bumping when you point at it. They know about hearts for a long time. But what does it do? So let's try to open a living animal and watch and see what it does. And so vivisection is like dissection, only vivi is alive. People started to do this and made huge advances in medicine through some pretty cruel experiments on animals and sometimes with people. Other people began looking at the stars really carefully, and they had, again, thanks to influence from Islamic culture and science, had these amazing lenses. And so they started developing lenses that could change how light focuses and realizing, hey, I can see a lot further with this thing, or a lot smaller into the micro world, and realizing, hey, there's more to life than we thought there was. Von Leeuwenhoek started talking about these microbes, these things are invisible unless you can see them. And Copernicus was looking up at the sky going, if you chart where these planets are and where these stars are, and then look at them month to month and year to year, it really doesn't look like we're the center of the universe on our planet. It looks like we're revolving around something else. And they started to find ways to test it. And the idea of, okay, if I think this is true, let me make a hypothesis and test it. That became a way of knowledge for the first time. And it's the introduction of the scientific worldview. Around the same time, thanks to explorations, people started to find fossils and realizing, why do we have similar bones of these massive creatures that don't exist anymore? Where did these come from? And why do you have the same ones here and the same ones hundreds of miles away? And why are animals so different in Central Africa and Northern Europe? And why? And they started to ask these questions. And so this is a super short overview of this idea of using science to categorize things and define things. And as you hopefully have already realized, with knowledge comes power, and with power comes a desire to get more power and to justify and protect the power you have. And so this is why the idea of race-based slavery became so important. Because at this time, the 1450s through, starting then, was the first time that slavery was justified on the basis of an attempt to do science. What I mean by that is slavery has been practiced all over the world. As far as we know, every culture of the world in the world and in the ancient world had slaves. So that wasn't a new thing at this time. But the new thing was the idea of justifying Christians, justifying slavery on the basis that these things that look so much like us aren't really human. They're something else. And they started to implement slavery on a massive scale. Starting in the 1450s, slaves were being brought to Europe. Columbus brought slaves back from the New World. And then coming century, white people would find that people with darker skin from Africa were able to survive in worse climates than people with light skin in the New World. So they would bring slaves over from Africa. And because all this is going on, so that part, the slavery thing, totally evil, totally intentional. But there were some other evil things that occurred that were not intentional, like wiping out so many Native Americans in North and South America by bringing over diseases. And at that time, they didn't know how viruses worked. They didn't know how bacteria worked. There was no germ theory. But Europeans who came to the New World tended to have lots of diseases that they had pretty good immunity to because it had been around cities in Europe and for a long time. But the people in the New World, the Native Americans in North and South America, the indigenous peoples, they had no biological defense and huge percentages. There's no real way to estimate it exactly, but the standard claims are 70-80% of the indigenous inhabitants of the New World were killed by diseases within a couple hundred years of Columbus arriving. So all that, those are some of the downsides of these new discoveries and this new knowledge. And I'll stop there with this one.